So for the last time, we realized that whenever there is changes to the transition, be it your shock, the persistent shock, couple of things do change. And we realize that your employment level changes, the wage level changes, what's again, consumption level and investment. So these are a couple of things that we saw. And we went into detail to explain what really happens. And before we ended the class, there was, I don't know whether it was Alex or Tanya who asked whether prices are supposed to be pro-cyclical and what's not. So that's what we are going to build upon today. Ideally, there happened to be an observation that was made. So this observation comes in two forms. The first one is the direction and causality. So we saw that there's a particular variable that wasn't captured, and that variable happened to lead GDP, and that's money supply. At the same time, it is said to be pro-cyclical. So the observation made was that money supply was first and foremost pro-cyclical, that is, it goes in the direction of GDP. Whenever GDP increases, it also increases. And secondly, it was seen to lead GDP, that is, its increment counts before the increment in GDP that we observe. And this was a bit difficult to explain in one way or the other. Why? Why? Because if you look at our money supply was assumed to be exogenous. It's just given to us. It's not really dependent on anything. So how can we use our RBC model to explain the fact that indeed money supply goes in the direction of GDP and money supply also technically counts before GDP? So these are the two things that we need to explain. With these two observations, we need to use question. Go on.
Yes. Will an increase in MS be considered an expansionary policy? Like only recession, decrease in GDP will cause MS to increase. Is MS counter-cyclical?
It depends. So we need to explain MS in the first place, right? So MS, whenever MS increases, you might want to call it expansionary. Whenever MS reduces, you might want to call it contractionary. These are terminologies that if you're okay with, you might want to attach it to this. And you might want to also associate them with government policies. So these are purely terminologies. But what I'm trying to put across here is we were very silent as to how money supply moves, right? We've not made any strong assumption as to the thinking of the central bank or the thinking of the government in terms of how they increase their money supply or how they reduce their money supply. So given the fact that we're very silent on that, we call that assumption, or we call that silence, exogenous. So we don't know what really happens to money supply. Now we would like to take a stand, and given the observation that we saw in the raw data, we can make a valid judgment that indeed this is how the central bank behaves. So when we come in and we make a judgment, we are no more silent. We are now keeping something that we call endogenous, something that we can now explain using the actions that we saw. So if we are very observant and our observation is really right, that's where Alex's question comes in. How does the observation that we see, how does it come in with regards to the data that we saw? Is it that we see an increase in money supply whenever we have a boom state? Or is it that we see a decrease in money supply whenever we have a recession? So these are things that we have to now really come in and make those decisions. But for now, We are starting on a very basic level, and we have to build on it. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah, so exogenous means we don't know what really happens to the money supply process. Endogenous means that we know what happens. But what happens might be true or it might be false. And we have to be careful about how we make that endogenous assumption as to how they change their money supply. So for now, this is observation that was made. And the observation was that whenever GDP increases, we see an increase in money supply. When GDP increases, money supply increases. That's the first observation that was made. And secondly, whenever money supply comes first before GDP, we also have to come and explain that. So I'll start by looking at this, and I'll come back to Alex's question, wherein he said it might be the opposite, because mostly whenever there's a recession, we see the opposite effect, which is equally true. But for now, this is what the data has predicted, and we just have to use our model to see how we can go with that. Is that okay with everyone? So let's explain how come an increase in GDP leads to an increase in money supply. So I'm going to claim this. Why money supply increment leads to an increase in GDP. So that's what you see. Money supply increase and GDP increase, which implies they are procyclical. So let's start by looking at what we saw earlier. We start by looking at the shock process. A shock happens today, and the shock might be an increase in Z. When Z increases, that might be the shock that we experience today. With an increase in Z, we know that Y is affected. With an increase in Z, we know that Y is affected. We know interest rate is going to be affected. We know money demand is also going to be affected. And this is what we saw in Tuesday's class. Whenever Z increases, we saw an increase in Y, we saw an increase in R, and obviously we end up seeing an increase in M. Money demand increases. So if you don't understand this process, please go to Tuesday's class, look at how we explain the persistent shock and how that affects these guys here. So this guy goes up, this guy goes up, and this guy goes up. The diagram that we use on Tuesday better explains this. And what do we see with an increase in money demand? So when you look at the money market, I'm going to draw it here. This is our initial money supply. Let's imagine this was our money supply 1, and this is our money demand. And this is the price level that we have in the market. And this is the money supply and money demand axis. This is the price axis. This is what we have. Now, with an increase in Z, which is the initial shock, Y is going to increase, interest rate is going to increase. We know money demand is a function of prices as well as function of output and interest rate. When interest rate, it's probably the opposite, right? When output increase and interest rate is down, money demand is going to increase. So this is what we saw. So money demand is going to be like this, because interest rate is down whilst Y is up. So this is what we saw on Tuesday. Now the question here is, in this type of situation, this money supply from the central bank was initially assumed to be exogenous. We don't know how it changes. We don't know the objective of the central bank. How does it look like? Is it that they are interested in keeping prices to be fixed? Is it that they are interested in keeping interest rate to be fixed? Is it that they are interested in booming the economy? We don't know. So that was why we kept it pretty much fixed, and it was very silent as to what really happens. Right? Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, seems so.
Good. Now, if we come in and we go like, hey, we now know what the central bank does. We now know that the central bank is always interested in, the objective of the bank is having a fixed price. So now we've developed a thought process, and we can now clearly see how the money supply changes. So if the objective of the central bank is to keep the money supply constant, to keep the prices constant or fixed, then with this change from here to here, they will have to come in and change their money supply to bring us back to normal. Because with this red line, it means the price has now reduced to P2. We've now moved from P1 to P2. P2 is not what we expect to see as a central bank, because the central bank, the objective of the central bank is to keep the prices always at P1. So we have this price P2, which is not what we wanted to see. So we have to come in as a central bank to bring our prices back to where it needs to be, which is P1. And the only way to do that is to increase our money supply. So when we increase our money supply, you go back to P1. So that's why with an increase in GDP, which is this guy, we see money supply also increasing. So whenever GDP increases because of this shock, money supply will also have to increase because of the objective of the central bank of keeping the prices fixed. So that comes to answer Alex's question. So here, because the objective of the central bank is keeping the prices fixed, we should see a pro-cyclical relationship. Whenever there's a boom, there should be an increase in interest rates to maintain the price level. If the objective of the central bank is different, that is to say, the objective of the central bank is to keep the prices always down all the time, then it might be the case that you might want to reduce the supply so that the prices will further come down, which will be consistent with what you pointed out earlier, that whenever there's a recession, we tend to see that the central bank increases money supply to bring the economy back to normal, which is equally valid. Is there anyone with any further questions?
No, not right now.
Oh, good. So that's the first.
Sorry, yeah. Yes, there is one now. Will money supply be a lagging variable?
So the observation that we saw, and as the book also pointed out, is that money supply is seen to be a leading variable, and we have to come in and explain. And that's what I'm just about doing, right? Unless, of course, you want to explain money supply being a lagging variable in a recessionary period. Question?
In this model, it comes later than Y.
Is what? Sorry?
In this model, it comes later than Y. So I think they mean in what you're explaining here, when Y increases and R decreases, that first leads to a change in the money demand, which is then counterbalanced by the central bank increasing the money supply. So the increase in money supply would come after GDP. So it would be lagging, correct?
That's a good explanation. Yeah, that's a good explanation. But here, we are just trying to explain why they go hand in hand. So with this explanation, it just explained the pro-cyclical relationship. Why is it that with an increase in Y, we see an increase in, we see an increase in money supply. So when you go with this explanation word for word, then your assumption is right, that indeed it might be a lagging variable. But the observation that they saw in the data was indeed a leading variable rather. So we have to come in and further explain why that might be the case. Is that okay? So what I just finished doing, it might look like a lagging variable, but actually it's not a lagging variable, given the data that they saw. So let me quickly come in and explain why it might be a leading variable in a way. But remember, whether you are a leading variable or a lagging variable, it does not imply you affecting output. So if money supply is a leading variable, it does not imply that money supply directly affects GDP. No. Remember the causality argument that we had. Whether you are leading or lagging, it does not imply that you affect the other. An example is people increase their spending whenever Christmas is coming. The question here is, whenever I see people spending more, does that imply that it will determine Christmas? No. So we don't have to say anything about money supply affecting GDP. So let me quickly come in and explain why it might be a leading variable rather. So back to the same argument. We have this diagram. We have this guy here. The central bank objective is to keep the prices fixed. Interest rate is going to go down. I'm going to give you guys, imagine that you are a central bank and you have 3 days to make a decision. Your objective is to keep the prices fixed. You have 3 days to make a decision. Your objective is to keep the prices fixed, okay? Let's imagine that today you observe an increase in the shock, or today you observe a shock increment. The question here is, with your objective of keeping the prices fixed, will you wait till the entire effect of GDP increasing kicking in before you increase your money supply, or would you react in a very good way? That is to say, would you go like, I know as an economist, whenever there is an increase in shock, GDP increases and price level will obviously change. Would you act faster or would you wait till the prices change? That's the question. You want to act faster than usual, right? So when you are a very good economist and you observe a shock increment, you might not wait till the point where GDP changes, interest rate goes down, money demand goes up, before you rather come in and increase your money supply. You wouldn't wait. You will not go from here to here to here, then come back and make a decision. What you would rather do here as a brilliant economist is, I observe a shock. I know this shock is going to cause a problem. So why not act fast before the problem comes into effect? So with this, money supply will be a leading variable because of you acting faster than usual. You acting faster before the GDP increment. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that's the whole idea. That's one reason why GDP might be, money supply might be a leading variable, because the central bank might act faster than usual in terms of it seeing the increase in the shock. So if you have questions, please feel free. If it's confusing, if it's not clear, feel free, ask, and let's go on. So if there are no questions, then we can now move on to the new Keynesian model, wherein we assume a couple assumptions here and there in terms of the sticky price and all this. So this is what we just finished with. So let's quickly build on the new Keynesian model, which is the next sub chapter under chapter 13 with a business cycle. So let me see the assumptions that we need here. The sticky price assumption, which is one of the key assumptions that we have here. Sticky price. Due to menu cost. This is very important as we build on the model. So there are two important models that we have to keep in mind. The monetary intertemporal model and the new Keynesian model. So this is a new Keynesian model, which is different from the monetary intertemporal model, in the sense of sticky price. So please stop me if it's not clear. So this is the Keynesian model or the new Keynesian model, where we have a sticky price due to many costs in the short run. Unlike the monetary intertemporal model, prices are flexible. That's a key assumption, even in both short run and long run. This is the monetary intertemporal model that we did on Tuesday a couple of weeks ago. And this is the new model that we need to tackle. And the key difference between these two models happens to be their assumption as to what the price level needs to be. In the new Keynesian model, their belief is that whenever there is a need for someone to change his or her price, the person might be hesitant to change the price because of what they call the menu cost. So imagine the situation where I have my prices posted on the website. I sent out my flyers. I sent out my billboards that indeed the price of my coffee happens to be $1. So this flyer has been sent to almost everywhere possible. And the next morning, due to changes in policy, the prices has now changed from $1 to 1.0001 cents. As a business owner, the question here is, are you willing to go and change all the prices that you posted on the billboards, on your menu, on your website and all that? Are you willing to go and then change the prices because of just 1 cent? Are you willing to do that? No, right? So prices would therefore be sticky. Sticky means that the prices wouldn't change automatically. By the monetary intertemporal model, this assumption is not made. So regardless of how tiny the price changes, people will have to change their price. While the new Keynesian model is saying that no, because of the menu cost assumption, some might change their price, some might not change their price. And if that's the case, we might see a different result in terms of how money behaves in the model, just because of the sticky price assumption. Prices are rigid. Questions?
None right now, no.
Sure. So just keep that one in mind as we build on the new Keynesian model, that indeed prices are flexible.
Oh, yes, there is one question now. Is this the central bank keeping prices sticky or firms?
It's firms' decision. The firms are the ones that do make their decision as to whether to change their prices or not. But what the central bank does here is the central bank will have to, so let me show you guys one quick example here. So that's a good question. So remember, this monetary model, right? This is a monetary model. This is the demand from the household or whatever side of the market. This is the money supply, and this will give us the price, right? Now, coming back to what Tanya just asked, when the central bank comes in and changes the money supply, this action is from the firms. With this increase in money supply, the action from the firm has to be an increase in price. So the central bank changes the money supply with the implication that indeed the prices will have to change. And the price change will be coming from the firms, but the initial action was coming from the central bank, from their money supply and money supply increment and money supply decrement perspective. Is that okay, Tanya? Yeah, sure. So that's the whole idea. So let's quickly see how the new Keynesian model plays out. And one important takeaway from this model of sticky price is that money is no more neutral. Whenever you assume a sticky price assumption, then the implication is that money is no more neutral. Unlike chapter 11, where we saw the monetary intertemporal model, where prices were fully flexible, in that place, or at that point in time, money was neutral. But here, money is not neutral. So please keep that one in mind. Money is not neutral here. So when you go to the next sub-chapter, let me quickly draw it out, and maybe that might make things much easier. Before that, if you have questions, please draw my attention. Okay. Couple of things we need to point out. So if you go to page 374, you will see the models pointed out. So let me try and then draw them out. We have the same models as we saw under the intertemporal model. We have this guy here. We have the output here. We have the labor supply. We have the labor supply, labor demand. We have the output supply. We have the output demand. We have the price level, which is fixed. And because of that, we might find a couple of inefficiencies in the market. And this is the money demand. There's a money supply. There's a money demand. And this is the output level, right? And this is the interest rate. This is the wage. This is the labor supply. This is the labor demand. This is the output supply. This is the output demand. Money demand. This is the output. This is the output. This is the amount of workers that we have in the market. So technically, there are a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. This is the equilibrium point, and this might be an equilibrium interest rate.
Oh, we have a question.
Sure.
Sorry. Can you explain what money is not neutral means?
Money is not neutral implies that with an increase in money, the real markets will be affected. We find changes in the amount of hours of work. We find changes in the output supply, changes in the output demand, and all that. So that's what money is not neutral means. If you look at what we did in chapter 11, we realized that money was neutral because with an increase in money supply, we saw an equal increase in prices. And that's where the effect ended. It did not affect our output supply, neither did it affect our labor supply. So it didn't affect any of the real factors in the market. So that's the neutrality of money. Yeah. Money being neutral means it's just nominal. It doesn't affect any real factors. Further questions?
No, that's all.
Good. So we saw the prices to be fixed. And this is what I would like you guys to pay attention to. So this guy here, ideally, would have been the output that we observe to see in the market. So this is the output, the natural level of output that we observe in the market. This is the natural level of interest rate that we expect to see in the market. That's what we saw earlier. But because of the stickiness in prices, we might not find equilibrium points as we saw in chapter 11. Here, even though this is the ideal point, because of this sticky price assumption, we might not find ourselves here. So when you go to the book, one of the places that we might find ourselves is somewhere here. At this point in time, we expect to see the amount of demand is lesser than the amount of supply. So this might be the output that will be produced, while this is the ideal output that we expect to find. And this might be the ideal output that we expect to produce given this interest rate, but that's not possible. So we have this level, and the difference between YM and Y is what we call the output gap. The gap exists because the market is not efficient, because we are not in equilibrium, right? Is that okay? And that's all coming from the fact that the prices are sticky. The prices don't automatically change to move us back to equilibrium. Is that okay with everyone? If it's not,
okay.
Oh, good. And the difference between the interest rate that we observe in equilibrium and the interest rate here will also give us the gap that we expect to see in the market in terms of the interest rate differences. And all the other factors will be given to us. So please go to page 374 and have a look at the diagram critically, and hopefully it might make much sense. So here we don't have efficient or equilibrium points as we expect to find. Some markets will be in equilibrium, others might not be in equilibrium. So let me prove the reason why money is neutral in this sense, and we'll go for a break and we'll quickly come back and finish chapter 13. So let me look at the neutrality of money in this sense. I think it's the same diagram. I don't necessarily have to clean it. So a decrease in interest rate. If you happen to be around, please type your full name and type present before we continue. And if you have questions, please feel free. All good? Done? Everyone?
Seems okay.
Okay. So let's quickly see what happens when the money supply changes hands. And I think that's what you will see back in the next page. So let me clean this and make things much clearer. So let's see what we have here. We have money supply. So we are going to prove the non-neutrality of money. In the new Keynesian model. So let's imagine the situation where the central bank increases money supply. We initially had a point where money supply is the same as money demand. What happens if money supply increases compared to money demand? The question here is, what happens to interest rates when money supply is high? Imagine a situation where everybody has money and would like to go and borrow. Tanya has money, John has money, Lynn has money. I went to Tanya. Tanya said she's going to charge me 5% interest rate. I go like, no, 5% is too much. Is it possible that I can get a better deal? And the answer is yes, because I can quickly go to John. John might give me 3%, or I can go to Lynn. Lynn might give me 1%. So when money is in abundance, or when money supply is extremely high in the market, then it's easier to get cheaper loans. On the contrary, when money supply is not that much, that is to say there is only one person with a lot of money in the system, then the person will try and then exploit us. That is to say the person will increase the interest rate, and the interest rate in the market is going to be extremely high. So that's the whole idea, right? So when money supply increases, the interest rate in the market is technically going to go down. That's one way of looking at it. You might want to look at it from the other perspective, where the central bank reduces interest rate. But it's good for us to look at it from scratch, right? With a reduction in interest rate, what happens to consumption and what happens to investment? Anyone to help me? With a reduction in interest rate, what happens to consumption and what happens to
won't they both go up?
Exactly. They both increase, right? So this guy goes up because of the function of interest rate. This guy also goes up because of the function of interest rate. By the end of the day, what happens to YD? What happens to the high-grade demand in the market?
It's going to go up as well.
It'll go up as well, right? So we expect to see an increase in high-grade demand. With an increase in high-grade demand, what happens to high-grade supply? With an increase in high-grade demand, when the demand in the market is high, what happens to the supply?
Oh, will it increase to meet the demand?
It will equally increase, or it will equally increase, right? So we have supply to increase as well. Right? We have supply to increase as well. So this would be the naive way of looking at it. The naive way of looking at it is an increase in money supply, interest rate is down. Investment is up, this guy is up, this guy is up, and this guy is up as well. So even though money supply, which Ella pointed out, how does that affect, or how is it called, neutral or non-neutral? Even though money supply is nominal, it's not something that is real that we can, it's not something that is real. With just this increment, the real factors in the market has been affected, which is the supply of high-grade output and demand for high-grade output, because prices are sticky. So when you go to the diagram where we had a more accurate sense of it, that will be seen on page 376. Are you guys there? Do you guys have the book? Are you on page 376? Let's have a look at the dynamics involved.
We have a question.
Sure, feel free.
Sorry, can you explain why YS increases, output supply?
Good. YS increases because there is an increase in high-grade demand. That's the simplest way of looking at it. And remember, the market is not in equilibrium as of now, right? The market is not in equilibrium. There's increase in demand. And at that point in time, the firms are willing to produce, but initially, because we are not in equilibrium, they couldn't give us that much. With this increment, the firm is willing to give us as much as we want. So let's take a simple scenario, right? So that's a good question. This is YD and this is YS. So remember, we might have an interest rate at this point in time, and this will determine the aggregate demand in the market, which is the same as our supply, because this is how much they demand. But at this point in time, how much is the firm willing to supply? The firm is actually willing to supply something that is more than Y. The firm is willing to supply something at this point in time. It's willing to supply this, and this is how much was demanded. So the firm ended up giving us this. So when interest rates comes down, it might be the point that we might move a bit further towards this direction. And the supply will keep on increasing to the point where we come back to normal. Is that okay?
Will increase or will decrease in R cause decrease in labor supply, and so N decreases and then YS decreases?
Yeah, if you look at it from the labor market, I think that's equally right, where N goes much towards the upper direction. But again, the question here is, where are we now, right? It might be the case that this labor supply has actually reduced, but we are not actually where we want to be, which is somewhere here. At this point in time, even with a reduction in interest rate from here to here, this should have been the equilibrium point where the firm was willing to produce. But it's not able to do that because the demand is not that high. Mm. But if you want to look at it from the labor market perspective, for sure, labor supply might reduce, which will lead to decrease in output. But again, where are we in the goods market with regards to the equilibrium point? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the question. Yeah. So when you look at the labor market, it might be confusing. But when you look at the goods market with a reduction in interest rate compared to where we should have been initially, then it might make sense. So please have a look at the diagram. If it's still confusing, please draw my attention. We can have a look at it again after the break. Then we'll look at fiscal policy and monetary policy in the intertemporal model. Is that okay with everyone?
Sounds good.
Okay then. Take 5 minutes break. We'll be back at 10:50 to complete. So I'll off this on. Yeah, I'll just keep it on. Then you guys join me in 5 minutes, please. Are we back? Questions? Are we back?
Yes.
Okay, good. So if there are questions, please. Yeah. So if you happen to be here, type your full name and type present. We'll go ahead and start with today, the final part of today's discussion. Is there anyone with any question in there, John?
No, it doesn't seem so.
Okay, so Alex, back to your question as to the reduction in interest rates leads to reduction in obviously the amount of labor supply. Let me quickly come to Ella.
Yes.
Yeah, so Alex, back to your question, you pointed out that the reduction in interest rates obviously leads to reduction in the amount of labor supply, which I concur with you, that's indeed true. But given the fact that the prices are fixed and there is an increase in demand, the firm is obviously willing to pay higher wage to get this, to supply this higher demand and get the higher profits. So again, there will be higher wage, and with the higher wage, there might be a higher amount of labor supply. Is that okay? Alex, is Alex around? Yeah.
Yes.
So that's another point, another way of looking at it, yeah. The prices are rigid, sticky, unchanged. There is a higher demand. Firm is willing to hire more people to take the advantage of the same constant price, which hasn't changed, which will have gone down, but is still up high. And they are willing to pay higher wage for that. And that will equally lead to higher amounts of labor supply, which will lead to higher amounts of, output supply to meet the output demand. So money is not neutral in the new Keynesian setup. And that's only in the short run. But in the long run, obviously things will change and it will come back to normal. Okay. So let's go back to Ella. Sorry, Ella had a question.
Yeah. What page is the diagram you were talking about?
Sorry, if you have version 6 of the book, it should be diagram 13.6. Should be 13.6, right? Yeah. And again, if it's not clear, you guys should draw my attention. I can go through it. So let's quickly look at what we have here. So now that we know that prices aren't sticky, and indeed money can affect how the economy behaves, then we happen to have a tool that we can use. So remember the argument. The argument was that we have a business cycle, and the business cycle is such that this might be our long-term projected growth in terms of our output with regards to time. But along the way, things do happen, and events like COVID. So we might be in 2019, 2020, and all that. So we might be on track, getting to being on our long-term growth path, and COVID COVID-19 will hit us and our GDP will come down. It will keep coming down, maybe in 2020, then it will start moving up to where we want it to be. We might even go above our projection, then something will happen again, and it will hit us back below our path. Something happens again, it will move us above our path. So this will be the movement in terms of the short-run dynamics or in terms of the business cycle. Now, in the intertemporal model, which we saw money to be neutral, that is to say money did not affect any real variable, we cannot correct for this. So when we are hit with a shock and our GDP is down, ideally, we might be interested in moving our GDP back to normal as quick as we can. But we cannot do that in the intertemporal model because money cannot help us, because money is neutral. And neutral means that money does not affect any real variable, including our real GDP. So money cannot move us back to where we might want to go. But in the new Keynesian model, we realize that money has this non-neutral property. That is to say, money can affect real variables in the market. So if that's the case, whenever COVID-19 hits us, the government or the central bank can come in, correct our path as soon as possible, and we'll go back to normal, rather than waiting for it to correct itself. So that's the argument that you should have in mind here. We know short run, things do happen. We might go below where we expect to be. How can we correct it? Can we correct it in the new Keynesian model? And the answer is yes, if money is non-neutral. There are two agencies that can help us correct for this deficiency. The first one is the government. The government can come in and help us correct for this short run change, or the central bank. When the government helps in correcting this path, we call it a fiscal policy. When the central bank comes in to correct the path, we call it monetary policy. At the end of the day, the two will help us go back to where we like to be. But the question here is, what will be the final outcome in terms of GDP, in terms of interest rate, in terms of prices, in terms of amount of labor supply? They might differ. The intervention of the government might have a different effect compared to the intervention of the central bank. And that's what we are going to use a new Keynesian model to better understand how the two do differ. Do we have any questions or question in there, John?
Yes, we do. Yeah. So in the monetary intertemporal model, monetary policy is not effective in affecting the business cycle?
I believe so, because money is non-neutral, so no real variable will be affected. If the central bank comes in and increases money supply, the assumption is that the prices will increase right away to meet the increase in money supply.
Oh, okay. So in the intertemporal model, monetary policy is not effective because we assume that money supply is fixed.
We assume that with an increase in money supply, which might be the central bank's intervention, there will be an equal increase in prices.
Does that not happen in this model?
Because in this model,
because it's sticky, I see.
Sticky.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in the new Keynesian model, the monetary policy works in the short run only?
It works in the short run for sure, but in the long run, prices aren't sticky, right? And we only need it in the short run because at the end of the day, in the long run, we all go back to where we are. But in the short run, things are pretty much rough. And you might want to come in and correct them. We don't have the time to wait for the long run effect. The long run, things go back to normal, but for the short run, we are not patient enough to allow things to move up and down and be that volatile. We might want to come in with interventions to better correct what's going on. An example is the COVID situation. The government might go like, hey, COVID has hit us, and we know that it will go away and the economy will come back to normal, maybe in 5 years' time. So we wouldn't want to come in and help people and help businesses and help, the vulnerables. In that case, people will really suffer, right? If we are to wait for the long run to finally come in and correct things, people will really suffer. So what we saw here was that the government introducing something like CERB, the central bank was also helping with the government interventions and all that. And these are short-run interventions. And it might be the case that their perspective of how money affect the system is based on the Keynesian model, which might be correct. Right? So we saw a lot of money being pumped into the economy.
Okay. And will the policy you mentioned on the whiteboard be considered a persistent policy?
What do we mean by persistence? The shock is persistence, and the shock determines the intervention of the government. So when the shock hits us, it really hits us really, really hard. And as policymakers, we might also want to meet it really, really hard, like throw everything at it. But as time goes on, the shock goes away. And as it goes away, you wouldn't be needed that much in interventions, right? So as it goes away, if we need to correct it, we don't need much intervention. We might need lesser money in throwing at it. But when it initially, hits us, like what the COVID did and with this lockdown, the government really, really came really hard at it, like giving monies, like giving companies all sort of interventions. But now the CERB is coming down, the government intervention is coming down because the lockdown is equally, reducing and all that. So the persistence of the policy depends on the persistence of the shock. Yeah. Okay. Questions? Yeah.
Nope, no questions.
Good. So we can have a look at how the government will come in and correct these changes, or how the central bank might come in and correct for these changes. So we start by looking at the intervention from the central bank, which is the monetary side of things. So if you want to find the page, Ella, you might want to go to 378, which is diagram 13.7. Anyone, if you're interested in finding the diagram I'm about to discuss, you might want to go to diagram 13.7. So let me see whether I can draw it so that we can all go through it together. So it's a bit confusing with regards to the diagram because of how they label the R1 and R2. So I'll try as much as possible to explain it. So imagine a situation where we have a market given to us. We have the demand, which is YD. We have the supply, which is YS. We have the interest rate. We have the Y. And this guy here, remember, is the natural level of output that we expect to see if everything happens to be correct in the system. So we have Y, I believe that's what we call YM or Y2 for this model. So this is where I would like you guys to pay attention. They label this guy Y2, but be careful. This might be the initial point, okay? Even though it's labeled as 2, it might be the initial point, or it is the initial point for this scenario. Even though this guy was equally labeled as R2, remember this is the initial point. This is the equilibrium point before the shock hitting us. So all the 2's happens to be the initial point. Then we have the prices here. We have the money supply and money demand somewhere here. Then we do have the initial money demand somewhere here, which is the same as prices as a function of Y2 and R2. And we have, I believe, money supply two. We have money supply one. Let me be careful with. We have money supply one. And we have the demand. We have the demand one somewhere here, which is a function of P as a function of Y1 as a function of R1. And we have price. Yeah, it's not consistent. Don't know how to, put it somewhere here, okay? Let's put it somewhere here. This is price one, and this is price two. So I find this diagram a bit confusing because of how they labeled it, but hopefully it might be self-explanatory, okay? So let's see what really happens here. The diagram assumes that we start by having an equilibrium point in the goods market. And there's a shock that happens, and because of that shock, the interest rate has now moved to somewhere here, which is R1. That's our starting point. The shock happens, it has moved our interest rate much higher. We can allow the market to correct for itself without any intervention. And how is that possible? It's possible because, have a look at this. When there is an increase in interest rates, the amount of demand, there is going to be this gap. The amount of demand is obviously lower than the amount that you might be willing to supply. And when there is excess supply, prices are going to go down. And as prices go down, we expect the money demand to be also affected, and things will move back to where we expect it to be. Just like what we know in 103. Whenever there is this excess supply, prices will keep on changing. As price change, the interest rates will start coming down, and we'll go back to where we expect to be. But this will only happen in the long run. And in the long run, everyone is dead. No one is willing to wait for the long run effect. No one is patient, and we might be interested in correcting for the effect right away. So instead of waiting for the long run to correct for itself, we might want to go straight away and see how the central bank might come in and correct for this effect. And that's what I'm about to do right now. This is the initial interest rate. There is a shock that has moved the interest rate much high. And because of that, the demand or the output in the market is lower than what we expect to see. So we have more or less like a recessionary picture. So what should the central bank do? That's the question that I might have to leave to the class, and let's see how we can discuss. There's an increase in interest rates. What is the best way to reduce the interest rate? Anyone to help me? Anyone to help me? This initial shock has increased our interest rate. What do we have to do to correct for this interest rate increment? Anyone to help me, guys?
Would we, I'm kind of just guessing here, but would we decrease the money supply?
Or perhaps increase it, right?
Increase it, okay.
Right? Or When interest rate is extremely high, it means money is very hard to come by.
Okay.
Right? So they might want to increase their money supply to correct for this change. Is there anyone with any suggestion in there?
Yeah, we have someone says increase money supply. Another person says central bank can just set the interest rate lower.
Exactly. But yeah, so both are consistent. But the central bank can set the interest rates lower through the money market by increasing the supply of money. So that's consistent, right? So we increase the money supply, right? The money supply will now increase. So we move somewhere. So if this happens to be our initial money supply, we've now moved the money supply towards this direction, right? But again, when interest rate is extremely high and output is down, what happens to our money demand? What happens to our money demand is, if this was our initial money demand, because of this interest rate increment and the fact that the output is down, we now have this blue line. But with an increase in money supply, this is what we now have, right? And that will move us back to where we want to be. But the only intervention, the only effect here is that the price level will now move much higher because of the increase in money supply. Is there anyone with any question in there?
No, not at the moment.
Yeah. So this will help us correct for the changes that we have in the market. So first of all, the interest rate is higher than expected. The central bank can come in and increase the money supply from M1 to M2. And when the central bank increases the money supply from M1 to M2, with any given level of demand, what we expect to see is that we might go back to where we were, but with an increase in the price level, because the price level is fixed at P1. Is that okay? If you have questions, please let me know. Questions, please. Let me know if
here we are.
Yeah, sure.
So the first equilibrium in the money market is the intersection of money supply 1 and money demand 2.
Money supply 1 and money demand. I think this guy.
Yeah, money demand 2.
I think this guy, yeah.
That would be the first equilibrium?
Yeah, that would be the first equilibrium. So that's why I said the notation is a bit confusing, so you have to keep an eye on the 1s and 2s. Alex? So that's a bit confusing. So this might be the initial point where we have the price at 2. With this shock, this guy will move up high, and it will move up high, and the money supply will now come in to correct for the increment in the demand. So remember, we come back to where we are, because at the end of the day, Y2 and R2 will be maintained, and the money supply will keep it at P1. So there's an increase in price level, but the same level of Y2 and R2 is maintained.
Okay, we have another question.
Sure.
So P1 was still the natural price level. So the increase in money supply returned everything to normal or natural?
No, I think P2 should be the initial point. So yeah, this is very confusing. P2 is the initial point, right? P2 is the initial price level. Y2 is the initial price level. R2 is the initial price level. That's my understanding. And with this increase in R1, the demand and reduction in Y, the demand for money is going to reduce. So it's going to move somewhere here, right? And to bring the interest rate back to this side and Y back to this side, you have to increase your money supply. So that's why the money supply is moving towards this direction. But remember, at the end of the day, the Y2 and R2 is going to be maintained. So your line is technically this line. and it's going to meet the new increase in money supply at this point. And that will give us a new price level as P1. So P1 will change whilst R2 and Y2 will be maintained.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not really okay with how they label their variables. They should have, I think they should have a very consistent way of labeling it. So if you don't pay attention, you might find it really confusing. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what we tend to see here is that indeed, the central bank will come in, and when it comes in and it increases the money supply, as James pointed out, the interest rate will come down. And whenever there's interest rate reduction, we expect C and I to also go up. But because of this intervention, the price level will go up. So that's the major difference. Keep this guy in mind. Here, consumption will increase, investments will increase because of the reduction in interest rates, but the price level will not be maintained. The price level will go up. If we were to keep this transition process for it to correct itself, so the long run, then everything here will be maintained, including having a fixed P2. P wouldn't change. We'll come back to P2. But because we are coming in the short run to correct it, from money supply perspective, P2 will have to increase. So keep that one in mind. That's a key difference between the long run and the monetary intervention from the central bank. Now let's go to the government. And
we have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So the price isn't sticky this time?
Yes, because the central bank comes in and increase the money supply. Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh,
yes.
But in the short run, the firms wouldn't respond to the shock in interest rate by changing prices. It has to be from the central bank, or?
No. I have to have a better way of explaining it. So that's a very good question. What should be the best way to explain this? Remember, the goods market is changing, right? The goods market is changing right away. And the price level. So Tanya, this shock is the initial shock. So the initial intervention is not coming from the central bank coming in just to increase money supply. No, they are reacting to a particular change. And that change is coming from this guy here, this interest rate. Unlike the initial neutrality and non-neutrality of money, where we started by attacking the money supply and seeing how the goods market changes, here we are starting from here. We are starting from the goods market. And there's a shock that indeed affected the interest rate. So that's the, what's the name? The firms are reacting to it by increasing their supply to meet the reduction in the interest rate. So just let's understand the transition. In the initial process where we started with the neutrality of money, the transition started from the goods, money market. But with this, the shock started from the interest rate. That would be another way of looking at it. Tanya, if I have not answered your question, let me know. I might have a better way of looking at it.
Oh, that was actually my question. So it seemed like you answered it.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Questions? Okay, then let's go and then see how the government will come in and correct for this change. If you happen to be around, please type your full name and type present. So remember, with this intervention, only the private side of the market is affected. That is the consumption and investment with an increase in prices. When the central bank goes like, hey, even though we've experienced this increase in shock, even though we've experienced this increase in interest rates, we are not going to react. we are going to allow the government, so let's allow the fiscal policy to come in. The central bank is not going to react. It is going to allow the government to come in and correct for the change. So the government goes like, hey, this happens to be perhaps where the initial interest rate is. The interest rate has moved to this side, and you are asking us to come in and correct for this interest rate. Let's maintain this interest rate where it now finds itself. So the government goes like, okay, if you want the interest rates to come to where we now have it, we might want to increase our G. Remember, YD is a function of C, I, and G, and perhaps net exports. But for now, we are in a closed economy. So when the government increases this guy here, YD also increases. With an increase in demand, the firm will also want to match the demand increment, right? The firm will also come in and match the demand increment. So we have this supply. Where is it? Somewhere here. Should I use a blue marker? So we end up with the same interest rate. So the firm comes in to correct for this increment in the interest rate. And at the end of the day, what we tend to see here is that the government coming in will help the firm also increase their supply. And with this increase in supply, if this is Y1, we now have an increment in our output, maybe Y3, because of the government intervention. There's a shock that affected interest rate, and because of this interest rate shock, demand reduced. The government is now coming in to increase the demand by increased government spending, which will shift this guy towards this direction. And as it increases the demand, the supply will also increase. And at the end of the day, they will maintain the interest rate where it now finds itself, because the government cannot change the interest rate. Only the central bank can come in and change the interest rate through the money market. So this is where we find ourselves. Back to the goods market. Back to the money market. Remember, the objective of the central bank is to keep the price.
Question here. Are we always assuming that supply is demand determined?
In a way, yes. And if you read the book, I think it will refer you back to what we did a few weeks ago. With an increase in demand, what we expect. With an increase in government spending, what we expect the supply to be. I think we looked at it, right? So if it's not clear, let me know.
Oh, I actually had a question.
Sure.
So could you go over, I understand how changing G or increasing G will increase YD. How does YS increase? Or rather shift, I mean.
So remember, in this model, right? How should I even put it? What should I even say? So let me put it back to what Alex asked us earlier. The firm knows a certain fixed price will be given to it in the short run. The prices is not going to change, right? And there's an increase in demand. The question here is the firm going to take advantage of the unchanged price and increase their supply to make good use of the sticky price, or would they just be unresponsive? So that's a question, right? So if the firm has realized that indeed at this point in time where the interest rate, okay, this is just an example, where the interest rate is high and they were willing to supply something that was much higher, but the demand wasn't there. When the demand has now increased, would they go back and increase their supply, or would they just keep mute?
Oh, I see. So it's a response to the increase in demand.
Demand, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So when you go back to the money market, we have the prices given to us, we have the money demand, we have the supply. And with this guy here, so if this is my demand and this is my prices, this might be my initial price. What happens here is this guy comes here because of the increase in demand. Because of the increase in demand. And remember, the prices are here, Y2 or Y3, but the interest rate is still R1.
Oh, my apologies. We do have another question here.
Sure.
Would lowering the tax be the same in the short run, or does the Ricardian equivalence still hold?
It depends on the assumptions that we make. So if, for instance, we say there's a lower tax with reduction in government spending, then the Ricardian wouldn't hold, right? It depends on the assumption. Was that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is what we find. But remember, the objective of the central bank is always to keep the interest rates fixed or to keep the prices fixed. So if that's the case, they will also come in and respond to this change by increasing their money supply back to it being fixed. The key point here is output will increase whenever there's a fiscal policy from the government. Will consumption and investment change? That's to the class. Will consumption and investment change whenever there is an intervention from the central bank? Will the consumption and investment change? Anyone to help me with that?
Wouldn't the answer be no?
And why is that?
Because, well, in this situation with fiscal policy, R isn't changing.
Exactly. R is not changing. So if R is not changing, if R is kept somewhere fixed, then we don't expect this guy to change. So this guy is equally fixed. So unlike the monetary policy with the fiscal policy, where G increases, this guy is fixed, this guy is fixed. But in the other markets, consumption is not fixed, investment is not fixed because interest rate will have to change. So please keep this guy in mind as you read, and you might find it confusing given how they labeled it. So feel free to let me know if it's not clear. We can have a look at it next week to better clarify it. So next week, I'm trying to look at the RBC model with more of mathematical intuition behind it. So I posted one particular file that you guys might want to read before coming to class on Tuesday because it's a bit mathy and you might want to read ahead of schedule. So that will be our key point for now. Yeah, question?
Yes. In this case, fiscal policy will cause monetary policy to happen as well.
Exactly. If they have an endogenous policy of keeping the prices fixed. Yeah.
So in this situation, sorry, I just have a question. MD changes because Y has increased. The aggregate output has increased, but there's no change in interest rate.
Yeah, because there's no change in interest rate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I think so. So if you have questions, please let me know. Have a look at the diagram again if it's not clear. Please let me know as well. So we meet on Tuesday and we do the math. Questions, John?
Yes. Is the quiz next week on chapter 13 and 14?
I believe so.
Okay.
Is this chapter 13? I think this is chapter 13. We don't have chapter 14. Chapter 14 is on inflation, and I might have to skip that and concentrate on the RBC model with more of the math and move on to the international setting where we now open the market and get net export and net import in. So that'll be our roadmap for now. right?
And then will the next quiz be on Thursday?
It depends on what you guys think. If you want it on Tuesday, on Thursday, let me know. If you don't, then I can still push it to the following week.
Oh, 1 second, a lot of people. So chapter 14 is on the Keynes model, which is the sticky prices model.
Yeah, chapter 13 is what we just finished doing, I believe,
Okay.
and where we had the business cycle with introduction.
In version 6 of the textbook, chapter 14 is on the Keynes model.
Oh, I have it as the Phillips curves and neoclassical. So for mine, I'm just going to skip that. So we are still on chapter 13 for now with the, yeah, I think they might have, I don't know whether my version is a bit different from yours, but I have it on chapter 13.
And then, so the quiz next week will be chapter 13?
Yeah, chapter 13, I believe chapter 12.
Okay,
right?
12 and 13. And then somebody asks, their connection dropped for the last time you asked us to write our names. Can they say their name now?
No, because it's I might be confused with what's going on, right? So just let's keep it like that, and hopefully next time around I'll have a way of looking at it. Well, you can feel free and then write it down, but I don't know whether I'm going to consider it because I have a way of just keeping up those who responded within a certain time limit. I don't know whether I can pick yours up because it's going to be on the last part, which might be a bit different. Yeah. Further question?
Okay. No, doesn't seem so at the moment.
I just have a question about the quiz.
Yeah.
So I think it was the third question. You were looking for the Ricardian equivalent in the answer about like if government reduces taxes, but government spending stays the same, then what happens to consumption?
Yeah.
So I was just confused about like, doesn't a reduction in taxes increase consumers' non-wage income? So it like increases their overall income, which would have an effect on their consumption because they have more money available.
Exactly, that's consistent. But again, if you look at the question and how I structured it, I didn't end by saying that it's only a reduction in taxes. I pointed out the fact that the government spending hasn't changed. So this is consistent with chapter 9 and 11, where we concentrated on the fact that reduction in taxes does not necessarily imply increase in consumption in the Ricardian equivalent setup.
Okay.
So I was of the view that because we had a narrow chapter, which is chapter 9 and chapter 11, then most of you will get a bit used to the concept that we tackled over there, and you will get where I'm coming from. And I try pointing out the government spending at the same time just to push your attention to the Ricardian equivalent.
Okay.
Was that clear with everyone, or did anyone have any issue with that particular question as well? So feel free if you guys are around and you want to say something around that question.
If you didn't mention the Ricardian equivalence theory by name, but you came to the same conclusions that you would have come to if you had, actually named it, would that still be okay, or would you need to name the theory?
I probably have to read it and see where your direction is from so that I can have a better sense of it. Yeah, you might say that the budget constraint will remain unchanged. And if the lifetime budget constraint is left unchanged, then obviously we don't expect any changes in behavior, which is consistent with Ricardian. So you don't necessarily have to mention Ricardian in that sense.
Okay, and then we have another question here. So the quiz is next Thursday, or can we push to next week?
Yeah, so it depends on you guys. You have to choose. If you want it on Thursday, I'm ready to have a new quiz on Thursday. If not, I can still push it to the next week, to the following week. Yeah. Questions?
Someone says next week.
Okay, so it's going to be this Thursday?
Yeah, this coming Thursday.
Yeah, that's fine if you want it on Thursday then. Why not? Was that a question or a choice? Sorry.
I think it was a choice.
Okay. Okay then.
I'm
If
not
it's
sure though.
Thursday, then it should be Thursday then.
Oh, not this Thursday, next week, please, they say.
Okay, the coming week. Okay.
Yeah. Personally, I'm for this coming week, this Thursday.
Okay then. Yeah, if I have people going for this Thursday, then I will just go for this Thursday because that's on the schedule.
Okay,
I don't have
so yeah, some people are saying so it would either be July 16th or July 23rd. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Someone else also says I'm good with this Thursday.
Yeah.
And,
so if
another person as well.
so, then it should be this Thursday then. Yeah, it should be this Thursday. And if you have any question on the quiz, let me know. If any question wasn't clear, let me know as well. Hopefully next time I might make it much clearer. All good?
Yes, I think so.
Okay then, see you guys hopefully on Tuesday.
All right. Have a nice day.
You too. Thank you very much, John.